Hello, I'm Holly, and today's video is going to be my September wrap-up. So September was a pretty good reading month for me. I read a good number of books and I ended up enjoying pretty much all the books that I read. So in September I read 8 books and this worked out at 2,752 pages. This was an average of 92 pages per day and 344 pages per book. And the average time that a book was on my own physical TBR was 13 months. This was skewed quite a lot though by one book in particular, which had been on my TBR since 2017. All the rest were just a couple of months they've been on my TBR. So actually it's probably more like, I don't know, 10 or even less than that, maybe like 8 if it didn't include that book, but 13 months, I'm not too worried about that. In star rating, I had 1 3-star, 1 3.5 star, 3 4 stars, 2 4.5 stars and 1 5-star, and this worked out at an average rating of 4 stars. In terms of format, I read 8 physical books, and then in terms of genre, I read 2 fantasies, 2 classics, 2 sci-fi, 1 paranormal and 1 contemporary. In demographic, I read 2 young adult books and 6 adult. In terms of where I sourced these books, 5 books were from my own TBR that predated 2022, and then 3 books were ones that I had bought in 2022. Then looking at whether the books were part of a series, 4 books that I read were standalones, 2 books were continuations in series, and then 2 books were the finales in series. So I didn't start a new series in September, very happy about that. And then in terms of whether I had read these authors before, 5 books were from authors that I had read before and 3 books were from new to me authors. And that's it for my stats, so let's get into my ranking and my reviews. Unfortunately, my least favourite book of the month was The Perfect Nine by Ngũgĩ Thiong'o. This wasn't a bad book by any means, I still gave it 3 stars, it just didn't have like the emotional punch that I wanted it to have. This is a novel written in verse, which is a retelling of Kenya's founding myth of the Gikuyu people. Essentially it follows these 10 daughters and a bunch of suitors arrive, and the daughters are allowed to pick whoever they want to marry, and to test the mettle, I guess, of the suitors they go on this journey to kind of find this magical cure. And I will say before I get into my review that a big part of this book is about curing a disability, so do be aware of that going into it. I don't like that in books, but I'm not here to criticise someone's like founding myth, because I assume that is the story, but it just, as a modern reader, just be aware of that going into this. But I did quite enjoy this one. I loved learning more about Kenyan folklore and myth. That's something that I want to learn a lot more about for a lot of different countries and cultures. And this was very much like a fairy tale, the way that it was written. You could very much hear it. It definitely is something that should be read out loud. And it's really just following them on this journey. There's a bunch of ogres and other obstacles that they have to face. And overall, it was just a very quick and fun read. I did like the feminist undertones in this. There is a lot of like equality between men and women, and I like that. But it did lack a little bit of depth for me, and that's why it was only a 3-star read. The next book is Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu. I gave this one 3.5 stars. This is a very short classic novella following this girl, and she lives in this big manor house with her father and just a couple of servants. She's very isolated, there's miles until the next house, and then one day this woman arrives called Carmilla, and things go from there. I'm not going to say too much more because this one is so short, it's only about 100 pages, but I really enjoyed this one as well. I loved the gothic atmosphere. I'm really into gothic classics and I want to read a lot more. I might have plans for something to do with that in the new year, so look out for that. And I also really loved like the queer undertones to this. The relationship between the main character and Carmilla, it is very much like this infatuation, this love. And I know that maybe the author was being critical of that, but I'm gonna take it because I enjoyed it. I also particularly enjoyed the descriptive writing in this. There was one description in particular that I just loved, where the author described someone as having a pale face as smooth as a pumpkin, and I just really liked it. It was just a really great classic for the spooky season. I'd highly recommend it, especially if you like things like Dracula. I think this one was quite an inspiration for Bram Stoker, and I can see a couple of like references within Dracula, like the setting, the way that vampires exist and their powers. So I think if you've liked Dracula or you're interested in reading Dracula, I would definitely recommend picking this one up as well. My 6th favourite book of September was Magic Study by Maria V. Snyder. This is a young adult / new adult fantasy following this girl called Yelena. In the first book, she is on death row, essentially. She's awaiting execution because she has killed a man, and then she is given this opportunity to become the food taster for the commander. And there is a lot more to this story. In this one, you're exploring a different part of the world. There's obviously magic in this one, and Yelena is like learning about her magical abilities. And I really enjoy this series. It's a bit of a palate cleanser for me. There are some darker moments, but it's also just very like light and fun, very action-packed, and it's just a nice book to kind of split up the more heavy-going books. I also really enjoy the characters in this, although Yelena did get on my nerves a little bit in this one. She was very just impulsive. I think that's just her character, but everyone will tell her, don't do this thing. And guess what she does? She does the thing over and over again. So that was a little bit annoying. And I'm also not a fan of the romance. We're just not going to talk about that. And I have been buddy reading this one with Beth, so thank you, Beth, again. I'm really enjoying doing this buddy read. It's been on my shelves for years. This was the book that I had since 2017 on my TBR, so I'm so happy that I could finally get to it. Overall, I really enjoyed this. It was a lot of fun, and I would definitely recommend this series, and I will be reading Fire Study in October. The next book I have to talk about is Monsters of Men by Patrick Ness. This was the first book that I finished in September, so it has been a while since I read this, but this is the third and final book in the Chaos Walking trilogy, which is a dystopian trilogy, and in the first book you're following this boy called Todd, and he lives in this world where there are no women and all the men can hear each other's thoughts, and then one day he stumbles across this area of silence. He meets a girl for the first time, and this leads him on this big journey. This series deals with so many like deep, hard topics. It looks at war, it looks at colonialism and colonization, it looks at misogyny, it looks at masculinity, toxic masculinity, and there's just so much in this. A lot of trauma, a lot of pain, and I will give you a warning if you do want to pick up this series that it doesn't shy away from showing like the realities of war, bombing, death, disease. Like, there's a lot in here, so just be aware. But I loved this series. I read this when I was younger, so this was a reread for me, and I think that I loved it just as much as the first time. I love the characters, I'm so invested in them, I want them to succeed, and the ending I think could be a little bit controversial because it doesn't really answer all of the questions. It kind of just leaves you thinking what could happen next. And I don't know whether that was the author's like thinking, oh, I might write in this series again, or I might follow these characters again, and he just wanted to leave it a little bit open-ended. I don't know, but I don't mind open endings. I kind of like the idea that you can continue the story and see like where you think it would have gone, so that didn't bother me too much, but I do think some people wouldn't be a huge fan of that. But that's pretty much all I had to say. I thought this was a fantastic conclusion to the series, and I do want to pick up some more Patrick Ness. I think I've read A Monster Calls, but that might be the only other book that I've read from this author, so I definitely want to pick up more of this author's work in the future. My fourth favourite book of the month was another gothic classic, and that is The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. This is one that I've had my eye on for years. I love music in books, and obviously this is literally about the opera. And this one is set in the Paris Opera House, and there is this phantom, this opera ghost, who has his own box reserved for him. He kind of blackmails the managers to give him like a monthly allowance, and he ends up getting infatuated with this singer called Christine, and I really enjoyed this one. I gave it 4 stars. It was so over the top and melodramatic, and I loved that. The opera ghost Eric is such an interesting and complex character. I love the whole feel and atmosphere of this. It also had a very interesting writing style in that it's kind of looking back, so you know certain things have happened, maybe certain people have gone missing, and it's really telling you what happened and telling the truth, telling this story that people don't know. It's also, I think, very accessible if you are a little bit worried about going into classics. I don't think this one is too hard to get into. It's not that old. I think it's from like 1911, something like that. So it's not like that old, so it might be a little bit easier to get into. I will say that while Eric is very complex and very three-dimensional, I do think a couple of the other characters were a little bit flat, but I don't really mind because Eric is such a great character, but that kind of probably let it down a star because you're really just focusing on this one individual, and there are some absolutely stunning quotes in this. I would definitely consider reading this one again and actually annotating it. I didn't really annotate it this time, but there were some quotes that I wish I had just like tabbed, but nevertheless I thoroughly enjoyed this one, as you can tell, and I would highly recommend it, especially during the spooky season. It definitely has that melodrama, the ghostliness, and I think that it's perfect for this time of the year. My third favourite book of September was Dreadful Company by Vivian Shaw. This is the second book in the Dr. Greta Helsing trilogy. The first book is called Strange Practice, and this series follows this woman called Greta Helsing, who is the doctor to London's supernatural underworld, and in this one she is actually travelling to Paris to go to this medical conference, and it turns out that Paris is infested by a coven of vampires, and she kind of gets dragged into this. I absolutely love this series. I gave this one a 4.5. I think I gave the first one 4.52. It's just so fun, over the top, and this series is such an homage to like gothic classics. So for example, in this one you do spend a lot of time in the Paris Opera House. There's a lot about the Phantom of the Opera. There were also mentions of Frankenstein, Les Mis, and at one point there was just Oscar Wilde's ghost chilling in a graveyard. It's got all these nods to these gothic classics, but it just brings it into the modern day, gives it this fun twist, and overall I just think this series doesn't get as much love as it should. If you love gothic classics, or even if you haven't read them but you like that whole feeling, you like something a bit spooky but also very fun, I think that you would absolutely love this. And there's a moment where there's the coven of vampires, you meet them and they put like glitter on them to make them sparkle. It's just very like tongue-in-cheek, making fun of a lot of the tropes, but doing it in such a great way. So yeah, I'd highly recommend this series if you haven't picked it up yet. My second favourite book of September was Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is the second book that I have read from this author. The first one that I read was Never Let Me Go, and I absolutely adored that one. I gave that one 5 stars, and this was so close to a 5 stars. It just missed out on the 5-star feels, but this was a fantastic book. I gave it 4.5 stars, and what I've learned about this author's writing style from the 2 books that I've read is the books aren't very action-packed. They're very like internal and quiet and just looking at people's emotions, looking at how people deal with certain situations. And this book follows Clara, who is an artificial friend. She is this android, and essentially these artificial friends are purchased for children to be an artificial friend, and they only last so many years until the child has grown up, and then they are kind of just recycled. And it's just such an examination of life, and Clara, the child that she's been chosen for, is ill, and that is a huge theme in this, a mother dealing with a very sick child. And oh, it was such a gut punch. I read a big chunk of this in one go, the end bit, and at the end I was just sat there just like, wow, that was a book. Also, something that this author can do is make his books very intriguing. There's lots of like unanswered questions at the beginning and you just want to know what's going on. There's a lot about this child, a lot about why the mother wanted to get Clara in the first place, and it takes you a long time to get those answers, but when you get them they're so satisfying and it really keeps you wanting to read more. This definitely feels like a book that you could reread over again and study and deconstruct, because there's so many interesting discussions on religion, the world, the environment, morality, AI, science. There's just so much going on in this book, but it's just very quiet, contemplative. you're not really getting these huge action-packed moments. It's just you're spending time with the characters and you're looking at their thoughts and their behaviours and why people do certain things. And this book definitely solidified Ishiguro as a must-buy author for me. I definitely want to go back and read more of his backlist because the 2 books that I've read have been incredible. And yeah, if you like any kind of book that is dealing with like the human condition, I think that you would definitely enjoy this, and I definitely recommend this one as well as Never Let Me Go. And then my favourite book of the month, this is a bit of a shift in tone, but that is Act Your Age Eve Brown by Talia Hibbert. This is the 3rd book in the Brown Sisters trilogy, which is a series of companion romance novels following the Brown sisters, and in this one you're following the youngest sister Eve, and she can't really stick to anything. She tries things out, she starts a new career, and then something goes wrong and she can't deal with failure very well, so she just gives up. And her family have kind of had enough of this, and they've given her this ultimatum that if she doesn't get a job and stick with it for a year, they're going to cut her off. And she ends up driving away in this emotional state. She's very upset, and she stumbles across this B&B, and there is a job going for a cook. She can cook, so she decides to go for this, and I'm not going to tell you too much more than that. This one is a romance, so you can kind of guess what might happen with the owner of the B&B and her, and I think that this is my favourite romance ever. I know that this one isn't people's favourite one in the series, but I loved this. It's got a grumpy sunshine dynamic, just seeing their slow build-up of their relationship, it's so good. These books are also incredibly funny, they are also incredibly steamy. If you're not into explicit sexual content, maybe don't pick up this series because it does get quite explicit as you go along. But in my opinion, there was absolutely nothing wrong with this book. It was so heartfelt. There are a lot of moments in this series in particular that deal with harder topics like anxiety, like chronic illness. That's a big theme in the first book, and in this one you have 2 autistic protagonists, and that was something that personally I just absolutely loved because I am autistic, and I loved how in this one you were shown a different side of autism, because I do think a lot of books can fall very much into a stereotype, and there is so much variation, especially in women. By the end I had tears of joy in my eyes from reading this. I love the B&B setting as well. I love cooking, I love that element of the story, I love the music element of the story. This was just like perfect for me, and I feel like if you are into romance and you haven't read this series, I don't know what's wrong with you, because this is just like one of the best romance series I've ever read. I haven't read too much romance, but this is like perfect, so I don't really know what could surpass it. But yeah, those are my thoughts on Act Your Age Eve Brown. I definitely want to pick up more books from this author, and I think there's actually even going to be some books maybe following some of the like side characters maybe. I'm not entirely sure, I'll see what the future holds, but yeah, I absolutely love this, and it was my favourite book of September. And that's it. That is my September wrap up. I feel like this video has been quite long, so if you've stuck to the end, maybe we should leave an emoji. I don't know, maybe like a star emoji, because I had a lot of absolutely fantastic reads in September. Leave a comment letting me know what books you loved in September. I'm always looking for some recommendations, especially if you can think of recommendations based on some of the ones that I've read, like maybe what's your favourite romance, your favourite gothic classic, let me know. But that's it for today's video. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and to everyone out there, stay curious. Bye!